Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I've got a real treat for you today. We're looking at LK Chen's Roaring Dragon two-handed Jian. So I guess a lot of you watching this video will have seen my previous video looking at the magnificent Chu Jian, which is essentially a one-handed sword, which I reviewed very highly. I love it. A beautiful, beautiful sword. This is from the same period, so it's a replica of types of sword that are found archaeologically and in museums and private collections from around 2,200 years ago. So we're talking about 200 BC. And it is essentially the big two-handed version of the previous Jian we're looking at from the Chu kingdom. And this is a very specialized weapon. And yes, the real headline here is that the Chinese invented the longsword. Is this a longsword? Well, I think to all intents and purposes, yes, it is a longsword. So let's have a little look at the blade. The blade, as we saw with the magnificent Chu Qian, this Roaring Dragon Qian from LK Chen has the same blade section. I'll just put the scabbard down for a second. So you can hopefully see there that it is double fullered and then coming down to the edge bevel, nice edge on here. I'll talk a bit more about the edge, and we will look at some cutting, and we'll look at the way that this sword tracks and moves in the air as well. But it is essentially a scaled up, in terms of the blade, it's a scaled up version of the standard one-handed Chu Qian, which was used with a shield. This obviously was not used with a shield. Now you might be thinking, before we go into the specifics of this actual sword, why were they able to use, or why in this period did they decide to use long swords? Now it's interesting because there's a parallel here with medieval European history. So in the medieval world, when we see longswords start to appear when armour, plate armour, starts to reach almost its sort of conclusion in terms of its protectiveness. And so shields, at least for the knightly classes, shields start to be used less, and therefore two-handed weapons become more useful, and the two-handed sword, or the longsword, starts to predominate from about 1360, 1370 in Europe. But rewind about 1500 years in China, when the longsword was essentially invented, the steel longsword, and there had been bronze versions as well, and this is modelled on the bronze swords that went before, with the new technology of new steel blades. And this longsword was made possible by the fact that the Chinese at this time, particularly in the Chu controlled areas, were using essentially plate armour. They were using a type of armour made of, well, various types in fact, but amongst other types there was rhino hide used and all sorts of other things, which meant that they were very comprehensively armoured and protected, and that to some extent probably enabled the use of these two-handed swords. And just like in medieval Europe, these swords became a symbol of, I suppose, prestige and power as well. So these started to be carried to some degree by people who weren't wearing armour, particularly in, you know, generals and things like that, perhaps in civilian life, as a kind of badge of office. Now the proportions of this are quite impressive. What you're seeing here is it compared to the Albion ringek. Now the Albion ringek is a fairly kind of typically sized European longsword of the 15th century, and this, as you can see, is a big sword. This is a long sword, although it's not particularly big in terms of its proportions. As you'll see, it's actually got a very slender blade, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. And it is essentially a lengthened version of the one-handed Chu Jian that went, well, before and at the same time as it, used with a shield. And they simply lengthened it. Now, this blade is a whopping 39.5 inches long. That is a seriously long blade, even by sort of medieval Renaissance European standards. The fact that they were making steel blades 200 years before Christ, so 200 BC, 2,200 years ago, they were making steel blades of these slender proportions and this length, is quite frankly stunning. Now, some people have questioned what characteristics these blades had. Obviously bronze, it has very different characteristics, and bronze tends to bend and stay bent. Steel has the ability, of course, to be tempered, so that it hardened and tempered so that it is a spring. And we know that at least some of the originals were like this, because some of the originals have actually been tested in private collections and have been shown to be flexible. Now this particular blade obviously is made of modern steel, but it is pattern welded, which is representative of the fact that the original steel blades that were being used for these were probably of a laminate construction. These are pattern welded, I believe between 1065 steel and T8, if I remember correctly. So it's quite a modern modern combination of steels, but it does give the look of the original sort of blades in the terms of you can see the complex structure and grain in the actual blade itself. And it's not just a mono steel, you know, basic shiny modern kind of flat blade, and we do see structure in the original blades that have been polished and re-etched, but additionally it is pretty much exactly the same proportions as the original blades, and therefore, you know, it is this slender type of blade. It is slender, more slender than most European longswords, and it's more akin actually to some sort of, shall we call them side sword or slightly later period European blades. That means it is, for its length, quite a slim sword. It does also mean, therefore, if we start to look at the characteristics of this actual model, that it is relatively flexible and bendy. And that does mean that with such a long grip, for example, if I smack the pommel, you can see how much the blade does wibble. Now, we do find this with other sorts of swords, both European and Indian and certain African swords, where they're relatively narrow and thin for their length. And you have to be wary of that when you're cutting, which we're going to do a bit of in a minute. You have to be wary of that with your edge alignment because they're fairly unforgiving blades. The advantage is they're light. Incidentally, just off the cuff, you do find a comparable situation with, for example, Highland claymores, the two-handed swords used in the Highlands of Scotland, and that they're very often, although they're quite broad, they're quite thin blades and they're quite flexible. And these are quite unforgiving in the cut. If your edge alignment is off, you don't have stiffness in the blade to kind of drag the edge through, it's gonna over accentuate the fact that your edge alignment is off, and it's going to flex and it won't cut. So these blades are unforgiving in that sense, but they are very light. So as a result of this slenderness and this relative, although it starts off 7 millimeters here and goes down to about 2.5 millimeters down here, so it has got good distal taper, but because it is a relatively slender blade and therefore fairly flexible, it does mean it's light. Okay, so you've got pros and cons there, you've got advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that this whole sword, despite its massive size, and if I just put the tip on the ground, I'm 6'1", if I put the tip about 184 centimeters or something, if I put the tip on the ground, you can see it comes up to the center of my chest. So this is the length of a long 15th century longsword from Europe. But despite its size, or length at least, it is only about 1150 grams. It's remarkably light for its size. That being said, it's not ludicrously light. It is heavier than most one-handed swords, for example, so as you would expect for its size. So it doesn't feel sort of shockingly light, or it doesn't feel disconcertingly light. It still feels like it has authority in the blow, and whether you hold it with the hands far apart or you hold them together, it still feels like it packs quite a lot of punch to it. But for its size, it is a very nimble and light sword, and of course part of that as well is because of the minimalness of the hilt. Unlike European swords, we don't have a heavy pommel, we don't have a heavy guard, we don't have a complex guard. And it should be stated as well that these hilts are not really designed with protectiveness in mind. Think more along hilts that you'd find on polearms. This is purely something to hold the blade by. So it's essentially like a short-handled glaive or something like that. That guard is really there, although it provides some degree of protection to bashing your hands on things, particularly shields and stuff like this. It won't provide an awful lot of protection against other swords, but you have to bear in mind in this period these swords probably weren't being used that often against others of these swords. They were predominantly being used against people with spears, people with swords and shields and stuff like this. So it's really all about the blade, and the hilt is really just there. That's to stop your hand riding up principally, and the hilt is really there to provide a secure grip and a way to use it. Now, in terms of the build quality of this specific sword, so moving away from the history for a minute, and LK Chen yet again have done an outstanding job. It is very finely made, starting with the materials. We've got bronze used in the pommel cap and the guard. We've got a pattern welded blade of good quality steel, heat treated to about 58 Rockwell, so it's hard. It's got a fine edge. The fillers are perfectly straight. Looking along the blade, it has some rippling, but that's fine. It's nothing drastic. It is straight, there are no bends, and the edge is perfectly straight and doesn't have any twists or bends in it like this. So the edges on both sides are good. The fillers, as mentioned, are perfectly straight. The ridges are perfectly straight. The edge bevels are perfectly straight. The point is very nicely formed and very slightly, I would say, reinforced at the tip, which is always nice. The pattern in the steel is absolutely beautiful, stunning in fact, and the polish is tasteful. It's not a high polish, but it's not a satin polish, it's somewhere in between the two. It's a very good, and I would say quite historical looking polish. The fit and finish of the blade in the guard is very, very good, as you can hopefully see. The aperture cut through the bronze, or probably cast and then filed afterwards through the bronze, fits the blade perfectly, even though you've got this complex cross-sectional shape to the blade. The grip is this sort of same type of silk looking, I don't know what the composition is, wrap, and it's all very tightly done. There's no movement, there's nothing coming loose. I don't know if there's shagreen underneath this like there is with the Magnificent Chew, I can't see. So I can't comment on that. The pommel is very artistically cast with the concentric rings, cast in bronze. So slight constructional comments. So I would say some of the edges on some of the brass fittings, the guard is not too bad actually, but the pommel is a little bit rough around the edge there. And I will probably smooth that with a bit of wet and dry sandpaper or something similar to that. It would be nice just to see these fittings just polished off a little bit smoother, and making them just a little bit nicer to handle, especially with the pommel, because the hand might be coming up around here to do things. I believe Sword Sage mentioned something about bracing this type of pommel with the palm of the hand. I don't know whether that's historically accurate, but it's plausible, and it's something we see in European treatises. If you look at Fiore de Liberi's longsword section, for example, you do see him bracing the pommel, and we see it in other treatises as well, Codex Wallenstein and things like this. So it's completely plausible that the hand was sometimes placed on the butt of there, so you want it to be nice, smooth edged, and this is just a little bit rough, so I'll smooth that off myself. The grip's very nice, and I like the look of it, and I particularly like the fact that it is oval, which aids with edge alignment, great. We only know a certain amount about the original grips because obviously they're the first things to go archaeologically. We're left with the blades and the guard pieces, but the grips not so much. And I like the fact it's got ridges to stop the hand sliding up and down when you don't want it to. It aids in the kind of grip on your hand's grip on the grip, so to speak, on the handle. The only slight thing that I've noticed cutting with this and the Magnificent Chew since I did the previous video is these can be a bit slippery. If your hands are sweaty, or if you're tired, if you've done a lot of cutting, if you've done a lot of forms, you might find that this very shiny material starts to get a little bit slippery under your grip. Now, you could fix that with beeswax, and I often use beeswax on leather grips to make them more grippy for actual fencing, for sparring. That would be a shame to do on this because the beeswax would potentially mess up what it looks like. It would make the grip look a bit grubby and messy, I think. So a possible constructional criticism might be that the weave of this cord might want to be done in a way that gives it a little bit more friction to the grips. I'm finding it a little bit too slippy at the moment. In terms of the blade, now this is a complicated bit because I haven't studied many of the original Chew double-handed, two-handed Jian, and we don't have an awful lot of statistics shared online for them. But my impressions, based on handling lots of long swords and lots of large swords in my life in general, is that I personally would want the blade to be a little bit thicker at the base. It's currently 7mm. I actually think that it might, for a sword of this size with a 39.5-inch blade, it might be better if it was more about 10 millimeters. Now I understand that would take the weight up, although what you often find with distal taper on historical swords, and again I don't know if the Chu Jian fit into this, but with a lot of distal taper on a lot of other, whether it's European, Indian, African swords that I have studied, is that the distal taper is non-linear. That is, it doesn't go from say 7 millimeters to 2.5 millimeters in a straight gradient. Often what you'll find is it starts at maybe 10 millimeters and quite quickly goes down to about 7 millimeters, and then it only gradually distally tapers for a bit, and then maybe it suddenly distally tapers in the last 12 inches again. So if you draw it on a graph, it would be something like this, then this, then this. So it's, in other words, non-linear distal taper, and certainly in terms of military swords of the 18th and 19th centuries, that is normal. Non-linear distal taper is normal, and linear distal taper is very unusual. So I would say, and the reason, the important part here, the reason why I would say that this blade preferentially would be a bit thicker at the base is to add to stiffness. As I mentioned, these types of blades, which have quite a lot of movement in them, because they tend to flex more down here than you necessarily like, they feel a bit wobbly in the hand and a little bit less stable, and they're less forgiving in the cut. The final constructional comment I would say, and I do like this sword a lot, but I want this review to be as useful for you and as useful for LK Chen as possible, is the issue of sharpness again. Now this is a very good edge, and I wouldn't want to grab this hard and pull the blade out because it would cut my hand open. But I can run my fingers along the edge like that without any fear of it cutting. If I pushed a bit harder and did that, I think it might cut. So I would feel that there is just lacking a little bit of bite to the edge. But I will caveat this criticism with the fact that most production swords that I ever see and have ever bought and ever been sent to review, that is also true of them. It is true of some of the most well-known makers, one example being Albion, and everybody knows that that's a common criticism I make of Albion swords, is that out of the box they're not really as sharp as I think they should be. And in this case I think this is almost the same. This is almost the same criticism. It's similar to Albion sharp. So in other words, it's not blunt. Don't go away going, Matt Easton says that LK Chen swords are blunt. They're not. This has got a very nicely formed edge on it, very nice edge geometry, and very fine at the edge, but it's just lacking that final bit of bite that I would like to see of a sword for cutting purposes. And therefore I will use my DC4 stone, my Falconeven DC4, which is what I swear by and sharpen everything with, that I will use that on this and the magnificent Chu Jian that I reviewed before. However, for the purposes of this review and for purposes of this cutting, I decided this time I'm not going to sharpen it up. I'm going to try and cut with it as it is out of the box. Because for you watching, if you buy one of these, and if you're tempted, buy one, you won't be disappointed. These are really nice swords. If you buy one of these, then I want you to have an accurate representation in this video of what this will do to water bottles, which what I'm using here. Right. Final thing I'm going to say before I go into some cutting, and that is quite simply that I don't have access to tatami mats at the moment, and I don't have access to green bamboo. So I am going to be cutting water bottles, which are a very specific type of target, and different swords like or dislike different types of targets. There are some swords which cut well on all targets. Katanas cut well on most targets. But there are certain types of swords which do very well on X but don't do very well on Y. Water bottles are a very specific thing. They are actually quite hard on the outer side, but obviously have no structure on their inside. It's just water. The water is just the mass to keep them where they are. So it is what it is. This is just cutting water bottles, but it is a measure by which at least some of you will be familiar, and you're able to replicate. If you have a sharp sword, anybody can get hold of plastic water bottles and cut them quite easily and almost for free. Okay, so let's have a little look at how this does with the water bottles, and then we'll report back afterwards. Milk bottles are easier. Hit the wood there on one of those cuts, but no damage done. Right, so cutting is done. What are my thoughts? Well, there's a few interesting things that came out of that. First of all, my slight criticism of the edges of some of the bronze work on the hilt stand true and emphasised, I think, by that experience. They need to be smoothed just a little bit. They're a little bit rough against the hand. I didn't do any damage to my hands, but I could feel that perhaps with a lot of cutting, and certainly if I was fighting with this, if I wasn't wearing gloves, I think those would start to chafe on my hands a little bit. Funnily enough, not so much the pommel, as I mentioned before, but more the guard. In terms of the grip, I did once, my backhand did slip off the grip. So the slippiness of the grip, I think, is a slight issue, but it was only an issue with one cut, not with the others. Interestingly, when I hit the cutting stand or the wood one time, I hit right with the tip up here. Obviously it didn't do any damage to the sword at all. But I did feel quite a lot of shock in the hand, but I think you would with any sword, frankly, hitting with the tip on a massive great log like that. Those are quite heavy, those logs. So to be honest, I think that performed quite well considering it hit a large chunk of wood. In terms of the edge sharpness, I would stand by what I said previously. I have to say, actually, this sword cut better than I expected it to, partly to do with tip speed, because having such a long grip and a long blade, you've got a huge amount of acceleration. But I feel that it would perform even better and more effortlessly if it had a slightly sharper blade on it. The edge geometry is fantastic, but this edge does require a little bit of attention, fine polishing and honing with a stone, whetstone or DC4 or whatever, in order to really bring it up to what I would class as top level cutting. In terms of the wobbliness of the blade, funnily enough, I didn't find it an issue cutting this target. It might be a different issue if you're maybe cutting bamboo or tatami mat, I don't know. My experience, incidentally, with tatami mats is that edge sharpness is less important with tatami mats than it is with water bottles. With water bottles, if your sword's blunt, you often just can't get through them, not with a clean cut, obviously. Whereas with tatami mat, you can put really almost a semi-sharp sword through a tatami mat if your edge alignment's good. So different targets test different things, as well as they test the person in different ways, they test the sword in different ways. So this performed very, very well. I did have issues with the upwards cuts and with the Zwerchau type cut. The Zwerchau type cut is not something I do very much, so that's partly to do probably with user error, shall we say. Let's be charitable and say that's my fault. The upwards cuts, I don't know, I'm usually quite good at upwards cuts with long swords. I can't really say why it wasn't working well with this. I would put it down partially to sharpness, and I do think, as I say, look, I can run my hand along the edge there. The fact that I can do that shows that this isn't a really, really sharp blade. Sharp enough to do water bottles, so if you get one of these out of the box with this level of sharpness, you will be able to cut water bottles, but it's not really as sharp as you would like it to be. And you will be able to make more difficult cuts and cuts more easily and with smaller movements if the blade is sharper. In terms of how it stood up, nothing happened to the edges. There's no, chipping or curling or anything like that, but you wouldn't expect that with water bottles alone. Everything's perfectly straight and true. There's no bends, even though it hit the cutting stand at one point. It's all in great condition. There's no rattles. Nothing's come loose inside. I must say, I do know that LK Chen use, I believe, epoxy inside their hilts, so I suspect all of this is glued on. as well as being riveted through the kind of bits that go up the side of the pommel and that kind of stuff. So it's a solid construction, traditional, but I think they've put epoxy in there to just keep everything together as well, which I don't have an issue with actually at all. And most modern, or a lot of modern sword makers do that. Everything's solid and tight, nothing to criticise. Very briefly, we're going to have a look at the scabbard before I sort of wrap things up. Now, a lot of what I said about the scabbards for the Magnificent Chew will stand for this, because it's basically the same scabbard, just made bigger for the bigger sword. It's got the same kind of shape at the end. It's made of the same kind of wood, of nice thin flattened diamond section shape. It's very nicely shaped. I wish I could have all my scabbards for all my swords made this well. It's got the bronze fitting that I showed in the previous video that wears on this side. I won't put this, because it's got a wet blade, I won't put this in there. But obviously when you wear these big two-handed ones, they do stick out somewhat more than the one-handed ones. And then it changes cross-sectional shape sort of for the bottom third of the scabbard. And I will say once again, these are modelled on originals. This isn't one of, so LK Chen do at least 3 swords which are modelled one for one, exactly modelled on one surviving original. This isn't one of those. This is an amalgam. It's a sort of an average modelled on several surviving examples, as the Magnificent Chew is as well. But there are a lot of these surviving, well, relatively speaking. And this is really modelled closely on those original ones. There are even scabbards surviving. Obviously not in as good condition as this, but that's what these are modelled on. These are modelled on original swords from 2,200 years ago. So really, once again, fantastic work from LK Chen. I'm super impressed. I will be using this for cutting lots more, no doubt. I love the pattern in the steel. Their blades, I mean, not to say anything bad about their hilts, because their hilts are good, but their blades are absolutely superlative, really beautiful. And my only possible criticism of this particularly long type of Jian, and I don't know how this measures up against the originals because I haven't studied them firsthand, because they're in China and I haven't been there, is I am not certain that this is thick enough at the base of the blade compared to what I suspect the originals are. I suspect the originals are thicker than 7mm at the base of the blade, but I might be wrong. And as the cutting showed, it doesn't need to be thicker in order to still be a very effective weapon. It's just that I'm used to weapons feeling a little bit stiffer in the hand than this does. But the advantage is that this is lighter, therefore, and quicker, and it is a very quick and nimble sword. Another beautiful product, the Roaring Dragon Jian, two-handed Jian from LK Chen. Thanks for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe, please. And you can see other reviews in my review playlist. I've got a bunch of playlists. I've got one on Chinese weapons now that I'm looking at these more. So have a look at my playlists as well. Have a look at LK Chen's website. Obviously the links are all below to this sword, and I can only speak very highly of what LK Chen is achieving over there in China at the moment. Well done, and I will see you really again for another video on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!